Boards in the attic of my own daughter house were cold beneath my palms. I lay perfectly flat on the rough, unpolished pine wood, with my breath held tight inside my chest. Downstairs, the heavy oak front door clicked open. Then came the sound of boots. Heavy, expensive leather boots clicking against the hardwood floor of the entryway. It was Dominic, my son-in-law. But he was not alone. He was whispering to someone, a low, sharp voice that I had never heard him use in public before. "Go quiet," he muttered to the stranger. "She took the second dose an hour ago. She will not wake up until morning." My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird, but I did not move a muscle. "I am Thomas. I am a retired shipyard supervisor from coastal Maine. I spent 40 years looking at blueprints and measuring tolerances down to the millimeter. I know when a structure is sound, and I know when a foundation is rotten to the core. Right now, the life I had built for my only daughter was caving in right above my head. Welcome back to Dad's Silent Revenge. If you are new to the channel, please take a moment to click the subscribe button right now. Leave a comment below telling us which state or country you are watching this story from. Your incredible support is the reason we keep sharing these powerful accounts of justice and family truth. I was 68 years old when I realized that the greatest danger to my family did not come from the freezing winter storms of the Atlantic Ocean. It came from the smiling young man who sat at my Thanksgiving table, the man who held my daughter's hand while planning her slow destruction. I lay there in the dark of that attic, listening to my son-in-law lay out a cold, calculated plot to steal everything my family owned. My hands shook with a father rage, but my mind remained clear as ice. I knew that a loud confrontation would fix nothing. I needed proof. I needed documents. I needed to let him think he was winning until the trap snapped shut around his neck. To understand how I ended up hiding on a dusty attic floor in the middle of the night, you have to understand the town of Blackwood Cove. It is a small place on the coast of Maine, where families have lived for generations. Everyone knows everyone. We do not lock our doors, and we judge a man by the calluses on his hands and the honesty in his eyes. When my wife passed away 10 years ago, my daughter Elena became my entire world. She was a gentle soul who inherited her mother's green eyes and her love for baking. She took over her mother's small bakery near the harbor, and for a long time life was peaceful. Then Dominic arrived in town. He was a financial consultant from Boston with tailored suits and a smile that could charm the birds out of the trees. He started coming into the bakery every single morning at exactly 7 a.m. He always ordered a blueberry muffin and black coffee. He talked to Elena about art and books and things that a rough shipyard worker like me knew nothing about. I watched them from a distance. I mistook his polished manners for genuine respect. I mistook his intense interest in our family history for a desire to belong. When he asked for my permission to marry Elena 3 years ago, I looked him dead in the eye. I told him that I did not care about his money or his fancy degree. I only cared that he kept my daughter safe and happy. He shook my hand with a firm grip and swore that Elena would want for nothing. They got married in the small stone church overlooking the water on a crisp September afternoon. Elena looked radiant. Dominic looked like a man who had just won a grand prize. We owned a prime piece of coastal land that had been passed down from my great-grandfather. It was 60 acres of untouched shoreline with panoramic views of the bay. Real estate developers had been calling me for a decade, offering millions of dollars to build luxury condos there. I always refused. That land was not an asset to be sold. It was our heritage. It was the place where Elena played as a child. But Dominic saw that land differently. To him, it was not a sacred family memory. It was a jackpot waiting to be claimed. He just needed to find a way to get my name off the deed. The change in Elena did not happen like a sudden summer storm. It happened like the slow creeping fog that rolls off the Atlantic in late October. By the second year of their marriage, my vibrant, creative daughter began to wither away. It started with small things. She would forget where she left her car keys. She would stare at a simple recipe in her bakery kitchen with a blank, puzzled look in her eyes. Then came the constant exhaustion. Elena had always been an early riser who greeted the sunrise with a smile. Now she could barely drag herself out of bed by 9 a.m. Whenever I visited their house in the evening, Dominic would always meet me at the door with his finger pressed against his lips. He would speak in a soft, sorrowful whisper. He told me that Elena was suffering from a severe case of clinical depression. He said it was a chemical imbalance that ran in her mother's side of the family. He told me that she needed absolute rest and quiet. He insisted that I should not overwhelm her with too many questions or long visits. I trusted him. I feel a burning shame in my chest. Even now, as I say those words, I was a man who could fix any engine and spot a hairline crack in a ship hull from 10 yards away. But I failed to see the rot in my own daughter home. Dominic became the gatekeeper of her life. He handled her phone calls. He told her friends from the bakery that she was too weak to receive guests. He cut her off from the world piece by piece until her universe was reduced to the four walls of her bedroom and the shadow of her husband. During our brief dinners together, Dominic would always steer the conversation toward the family land. He would tell me that the taxes on the coastal property were rising rapidly. He would say that as a financial expert, he was deeply worried about my financial security. He proposed that we should move the deed into a family trust, with his name listed as the sole executor. He said it was the only way to protect Elena's future, if my health should fail. He spoke with such warmth and apparent devotion that I almost believed him. But a small, quiet voice in the back of my mind told me to wait. The turning point came on a rainy Tuesday afternoon in November. Dominic had driven into Portland for a business conference, and Elena had called me, asking for some chicken soup. Her voice over the phone sounded faint and distorted like a radio signal fading out at sea. When I arrived at the house, I found her asleep on the sofa. Her skin was pale and translucent, and there were dark purple bruises under her eyes. She looked like a ghost inhabiting a body that no longer belonged to her. I went into the master bathroom to find her regular vitamins. As I opened the medicine cabinet, my hand knocked over a small brown glass bottle that had been hidden behind a stack of shaving towels. The bottle had no prescription label from the local pharmacy. It only had a small white piece of tape with the letter D written on it in black marker. I unscrewed the cap and smelled the liquid. It was completely odorless, but it had a strange, oily consistency. My mind went back to my years at the shipyard. We used a specific type of heavy industrial solvent to clean engine parts, and we were always warned about the dangers of prolonged exposure. The symptoms of low-grade poisoning were exactly what I was seeing in my daughter. Chronic fatigue, memory loss, confusion, and extreme lethargy. A cold sweat broke out across the back of my neck. I looked at the little brown bottle in my hand, and the world around me went dead silent. I did not scream. I did not call Dominic to demand answers. My 40 years of discipline kicked in like an automatic circuit breaker. An angry man makes mistakes, and a mistake right now could cost my daughter her life. I carefully poured a small amount of the liquid into a clean plastic sample tube that I kept in my truck toolbox. I put the brown bottle back exactly where I had found it. I wiped the counter clean, and then I called an old friend from my high school days. His name was Thomas, and he ran the toxicology laboratory at the State University in Bangor. I told him I needed a private favor, and I needed it immediately. 2 days after I sent the liquid sample to Bangor, my phone rang at 4 a.m. It was the laboratory specialist. His voice did not have its usual cheerful academic bounce. It sounded heavy and strained by the weight of a dark discovery. "Thomas," he said into the line, "you need to get your daughter out of that house immediately. The substance you sent me is a highly concentrated synthetic neurotoxin mixed with an oil-based sedative. In small doses over a long period, it mimics the exact symptoms of rapid cognitive decline and severe clinical depression. It is hard to detect in standard blood tests unless you are specifically looking for it. Whoever is giving her this is systematically destroying her mind." A cold stone settled deep into my stomach. I looked out my window at the dark Atlantic waters crashing against the rocks. The truth was out. Dominic was not just a greedy financial consultant trying to steal land. He was a monster who was willing to erase my daughter's personality and sanity to get his hands on our family legacy. My hands gripped the kitchen counter until my knuckles turned stark white. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to grab my hunting rifle from the cabinet and drive straight to their house. But 40 years at the shipyard taught me that when a steel cable snaps, you do not run toward it with your bare hands. You step back. You calculate the trajectory. You analyze the stress points. If I went there with a gun, Dominic would call the police. He would use his clean reputation to paint me as an unstable, dangerous old man. He would get a restraining order, and then Elena would be left completely alone in his hands with no one left to protect her. I had to beat him at his own game. I had to let him believe his plan was working perfectly while I gathered an ironclad mountain of evidence that no lawyer could ever dismantle. Later that morning, I met with a man named David. He was a retired state police investigator who now ran a private security firm in Portland. He was a man of few words, with iron gray hair and eyes that had seen the worst of humanity. I paid him from my personal savings account using cash, so there would be no digital paper trail for Dominic to track. I told David I needed a full financial audit on Dominic, and I needed to know exactly who he was talking to when he was out of town. The trap was officially being built, and Dominic was about to walk right into it. It took David only 5 days to uncover the rot hidden behind Dominic's expensive suits. The financial reports were devastating. Dominic was not a successful consultant. He was a desperate man drowning in a sea of red ink. He had lost over $300,000 of client money in an illegal offshore cryptocurrency scheme. The regulators were closing in on his firm, and he was facing immediate disbarment and federal prison time. He needed a massive influx of cash to replace the missing funds before the end of the year. Our 60 acres of coastal land was his only escape hatch. But the most disturbing piece of evidence came on a Thursday night. David called me to say that Dominic had just purchased a hidden surveillance device and had scheduled a meeting at his house with a corrupt local real estate developer named Marcus. Elena was scheduled to be at her doctor appointment in Portland that evening. What Dominic did not know was that I had intercepted the doctor office confirmation and rescheduled the appointment for the following week. Elena was actually resting safely at my house under the care of her aunt. Dominic thought the house would be completely empty. That brings us back to the moment I found myself flat on the rough pine floorboards of the attic. I had used my old spare key to slip into the house an hour before Dominic arrived. I carried a high-definition digital audio recorder in my jacket pocket. I lay there in the dark, dusty heat of the attic, listening through the floor vents as the front door opened. I heard Dominic's footsteps followed by the heavier, slower stride of Marcus. The sound of ice clinking in glass echoed up through the vent. Dominic's voice came through the speaker of my recorder, clear as day. "The old man is the only obstacle," Dominic said. "He is stubborn about the deed, but Elena's health is deteriorating fast. By next week, her doctor will sign the paperwork declaring her mentally incompetent to manage her own affairs. As her husband, I will automatically gain sole power of attorney over her share of the estate. Once I have that, I will sign the joint development agreement with your firm. You get the shoreline, and I get the $500,000 advance to clear my debts." Marcus chuckled a low, greasy sound. "And what about the old man?" he asked. Dominic let out a cold, sharp laugh. "Thomas is an old shipyard worker with a bad heart. Once he sees his daughter sign the papers, the shock will probably finish him off for us." The metal stairs of the fire escape did not make a single vibration as I climbed down into the freezing November night. I walked 2 blocks away to where I had parked my old Ford truck under the shadow of an abandoned textile mill. I climbed into the driver's seat and sat there in the dark for a very long time. My hands were perfectly steady on the steering wheel, but the air in my lungs tasted like ash. I watched the cold rain begin to fall against the windshield. Dominic had not just planned a financial swindle. He had looked at my daughter's life and my own death as nothing more than lines on a business ledger. He was willing to hollow out the mind of the woman he swore to protect all, to cover his own pathetic failures. The next morning at sunrise, I arrived back at my house on the coast. I walked into the kitchen and began preparing a heavy breakfast of eggs and toast, just like I used to do when Elena was a little girl. When I walked into the living room, Elena was sitting by the large bay window wrapped in a thick woolen blanket. Her hands were curled around a warm mug of herbal tea. For the first time in months, the heavy gray fog in her eyes seemed to be lifting slightly. The absence of the synthetic sedative for just 36 hours was already allowing her true spirit to fight its way back to the surface. She looked up at me and gave me a small, fragile smile that reminded me exactly of her mother. I sat down in the wooden armchair opposite her. I did not tell her about the little brown bottle in the medicine cabinet. I did not tell her about the digital recording on my device, or the conversation I had overheard on the dusty attic floor. A mind that is recovering from prolonged chemical manipulation cannot handle that kind of sudden emotional trauma. It would shatter her completely. Instead, I spoke to her in the same calm, reassuring tone I used when guiding a massive ship hull into the dry dock. I told her that her doctor wanted her to stay with me for a couple of weeks to get some fresh sea air and proper home-cooked meals. She nodded without any resistance. She said she felt safe here because the ocean waves always helped her sleep without the nightmares. Once she went back to her childhood bedroom to rest, I walked into my study and locked the door. I placed a secure phone call to David, the private investigator. I told him that the foundation was set and it was time to pour the concrete. We had the recording of Dominic conspiracy with Marcus, but we needed to catch Dominic in the middle of an overt illegal act. We needed him to physically attempt the fraud in a controlled environment where escape would be absolutely impossible. I told David to gather his team because the final phase was about to begin. On Monday morning, I poured myself a cup of black coffee and called Dominic from my kitchen telephone. I deliberately made my voice sound weak and heavy, as if the weight of old age and worry had finally broken my spirit. I coughed a few times to sell the illusion. I told him that Elena's health was declining rapidly at my house and that I was deeply terrified of what would happen to her if I passed away suddenly. I told him that I had spent the entire weekend thinking about his financial advice. I said I was finally ready to sign the 60 acres of coastal land over to the family trust so he could manage the taxes and secure Elena's future. I could hear the sudden sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. Dominic tried to maintain his usual smooth, professional tone, but he could not hide the desperate, greedy hunger vibrating in his voice. He told me I was making the right choice for the family. He said he would handle all the legal paperwork immediately and bring it over to my house the following evening so we could finalize everything without stressing Elena. He told me to rest well and not to worry about a single thing because he had everything completely under control. The moment the phone line went dead, I called David. Within 2 hours, my quiet living room was transformed into a silent trap for a predator. David brought a state notary, who was a retired court clerk and a trusted friend of our family. We also coordinated directly with the county prosecutor office. A young, sharp assistant district attorney named Sarah arrived at my house in the early afternoon. She sat at my dining table and listened to the attic recording. She reviewed the toxicology report from the university laboratory in Bangor. Her face turned to stone as she realized the true depth of Dominic malice. Sarah explained the legal strategy to us. She said that the attic recording was powerful circumstantial evidence, but Dominic defense lawyers might try to argue it was an illegal wiretap under state privacy laws. However, if Dominic brought fraudulent trust documents into my home and attempted to have me sign away an estate worth millions under false pretenses, while my daughter was medically incapacitated, that would constitute a major felony fraud in progress. The trap was perfectly set. We placed a small, high-definition hidden camera inside the vintage grandfather clock in the corner of the living room. David and the assistant district attorney took their positions inside the side study, behind the heavy velvet curtains. The house grew very quiet. We sat in the silence of the old home, listening to the ticking of the clock, waiting for the wolf to arrive at the door. The grandfather clock in the corner of my living room chimed exactly 7 times, when a firm knock echoed from the heavy oak front door. I walked slowly across the hardwood floor and turned the brass lock. Dominic stood on my porch. He wore a sleek black trench coat that smelled of wet asphalt and expensive cologne. He carried a leather briefcase in his right hand. He stepped inside and shook off the freezing Maine rain. He looked around the quiet house and gave me that same polished smile he had worn on his wedding day. He asked me how Elena was doing. I told him she was resting deeply in her childhood bedroom, and that the cold sea air seemed to be helping her sleep. Dominic placed his hand on my shoulder. His grip was firm and meant to feel comforting. He told me that rest was the best thing for her fragile mind. He said he was relieved that we were finally securing her future, so she would not have to worry about the heavy financial burdens of the estate. Every word that came out of his mouth was perfectly calculated to sound like a devoted husband. We walked into the living room and sat down at the large mahogany dining table. Dominic opened his briefcase with a sharp metallic click. He pulled out 3 thick stacks of legal documents and laid them out in perfect aligned rows on the polished wood. He pulled a silver pen from his inside pocket and placed it gently on top of the papers. He looked at me with an expression of profound professional sorrow. "These are the trust agreement papers, Thomas," he explained with a calm, steady voice. "Once you sign the bottom line on these 3 pages, we will transfer the 60 acres of shoreline into the Blackwood Cove Legacy Trust. I will assume the role of sole managing trustee tonight, so you do not have to carry the burden of the state property taxes anymore. It will guarantee that Elena is provided for, even if her medical condition continues to deteriorate." I picked up the silver pen. The metal was cold against my calloused fingers. I looked at the signature lines. Then I looked up at the man sitting across from me. I looked at the man who had been systematically destroying the mind of my daughter with neurotoxins, just to clear his own illegal gambling debts in Boston. I felt a cold, absolute clarity wash over me. I laid the pen down on the table. "Dominic," I said in my quiet shipyard foreman voice, "I have a question for you first. What did you plan to do with Elena once the land was sold to Marcus?" The smile on his face froze for a fraction of a second, before returning to its polished shape. "I do not understand what you mean, Thomas," he said with a forced laugh. "We are keeping the land in the family." I did not say another word. I reached under the edge of the dining table and pressed the play button on my digital audio receiver. The room filled with the very own voice of Dominic, recorded from the attic 3 nights ago. By next week, her doctor will sign the paperwork declaring her mentally incompetent. The recording blared into the quiet room. As her husband, I will automatically gain sole power of attorney. Once I have that, I will sign the joint development agreement with Marcus. His face went completely white. All the blood drained from his cheeks. He looked at the audio receiver as if it were a venomous snake preparing to strike. He lunged across the table to grab the device, but the door to my study opened before his hand could reach it. David, the private investigator, stepped out from behind the velvet curtains. He was followed immediately by the assistant district attorney, Sarah, and 2 uniformed state troopers. Dominic froze with his hand suspended in midair. Sarah walked over to the table and picked up the fraudulent trust documents he had brought. "Dominic," she said, with a voice as cold as ice, "you are under arrest for attempted grand larceny, felony fraud, and the aggravated assault of Elena through chemical poisoning." The arrogance stripped away from the face of Dominic like cheap paint peeling off an old wooden hull. His polished demeanor completely collapsed. He started stammering and backing away from the table. He tried to claim the recording was a fabrication and a desperate misunderstanding, but Sarah merely smiled a cold professional smile. She informed him that the state toxicology laboratory in Bangor had already processed the hidden neurotoxin found in his medicine cabinet. She told him that his digital search history and offshore financial records had already been seized under a federal warrant that very afternoon. The 2 state troopers stepped forward and pulled his arms roughly behind his back. The heavy metal handcuffs clicked shut with a definitive sound that echoed through the old house. It was the sound of a trap snapping entirely shut. They led him out the front door, into the freezing rain. His expensive leather boots slipped awkwardly on the wet gravel driveway as they shoved him into the back of the police cruiser. I stood on my front porch and watched the red and blue flashing lights disappear down the dark coastal road. I did not feel any joy or triumph. I only felt the profound, heavy relief of a man who had successfully defended his home. The legal battle that followed over the next 6 months was swift and unyielding. His high-priced defense team tried to bargain for a reduced sentence, but the mountain of evidence we had compiled was far too heavy for them to move. The county judge sentenced Dominic to 14 years in the state penitentiary with no possibility of early parole. His financial firm was entirely dismantled by federal regulators. Every asset he owned was seized to pay back his victims in Boston. He was left completely bankrupt and alone in a gray concrete cell where his tailored suits and charming smiles meant absolutely nothing. Now, if you found this ending satisfying and love seeing true justice served, please hit that subscribe button right now. Do not forget to become a member of our Dad Silent Revenge family for exclusive videos that we do not post anywhere else. Let me know in the comments below what you think of the fate of Dominic and how you would have handled the situation. Your incredible loyalty is what keeps this channel alive. It is May now, and the harsh winter storms of Maine have finally given way to the gentle warmth of spring. The air around the house smells of salt water, pine needles, and blooming wild roses. I am sitting on the weathered wooden bench on our 60 acres of shoreline, watching the Atlantic waves crash calmly against the granite rocks below. Elena is standing near the edge of the water. Her green eyes are bright and clear again. The dark purple bruises under her eyes have completely vanished. Her laughter echoes over the sound of the surf as she watches a flock of seagulls dive into the blue bay. She is completely free of the poison, and she is baking again at the harbor shop every morning. Her hands are steady, and her beautiful mind is entirely her own once more. I take a deep breath of the cold, clean sea air and feel the warmth of the morning sun on my weathered face. The heritage of our family is safe. The land belongs to my daughter, and it will belong to her children long after I am gone. The foundation of our life has been cleared of the rot, and the peace that was stolen from us has finally been restored to Blackwood Cove.